So, Lord Skedelsky, it's the great pleasure for us and for me to have you during our interview on our talk show. So let's talk about like big issues which are quite important for the not only Europe, but it also influences on developing countries as well. So my first question starts from the title of your last book, which is going to be published right this year, and the title of your book is How and How Not to Do Economics. So what about that? Like the idea of neoclassical mainstream economics failed, and if it's failed, what's your recommendation?
Well, How Not to Do Economics it's a book about method, and I think mainstream economics often comes to the wrong conclusions about policy because of the faulty method, and that is assumptions which are not realistic about human behavior, very tight models which lead you astray. They're very good logically, but they point really to a very strong leaving everything, most things to the market, that their institutions don't matter. And so out of that stream of thinking, you get a lack of interest in society and how society works. You have a lack of interest in institutions, how government works.
And power relations as well.
And power, yeah. So they get the relations between people wrong, I think, or very oversimple, and they neglect power and the importance of power. And the trouble is they make invisible, the way they do their economics, they make power invisible. So everything then under the cover of science, neoclassical economics is very ideological. It defends the status quo.
Yeah, but it's interesting that it's the very ideological, but it talks to you from the perspective of common sense. You know, like they claim that it's not the ideological, but they say that it's the common sense.
Yeah.
And the idea of this common sense, like the neoliberal common sense, led to the big crisis, right, in 2008, which means that the world they described destroyed and collapsed, right, theoretically as well. When I always talk about the crisis of the modern globalization, modern version of globalization, I always remember the very interesting passage from the interesting book of Keynes, Economic Consequences of Peace, where Keynes has a good interest, you might know about that, where when he describes the everyday life of the middle-class Londoner. Keynes is writing that this guy is enjoying the first wave of globalization, then high-tech instruments like telephone, he's calling to the different parts of the world, make investments, make some goods, and he's sure that these goods and services will be at his doorsteps soon. But Keynes writes that this Londoner cannot notice the rise of the extremism, rise of the extreme nationalism, and Keynes is remembering us that we might be the same situation right now. So could you comment about that?
Yeah, well, the thing is, of course, that's the first wave of globalization, as you rightly said, and it looked as though this world would just continue and produce more and more prosperity for more and more people, and it ended in the First World War. So from that, you understand very, very quickly that globalization or economic integration creates tensions, very severe tensions. I mean, there are two types of tensions. I mean, one is between the winners and the losers within a country or you know, in the whole world. And the other is it creates a crisis of legitimacy, because you're trying to integrate markets, but then you don't have a political structure to manage the global market. There's no world state. And that is now apparent in the Eurozone. I mean, you have the tensions of different bits of the Eurozone. Some are more prosperous than the others. Obviously, the northern countries benefit from the Eurozone. Southern countries don't benefit nearly as much and have a lot of losses imposed on them. But no European government to handle the legitimacy problems which this situation gives rise to. And so it's a miniature version of the problems of globalization. Danny Roderick has described this very, very well, these trilemmas.
Yeah, globalization paradox.
Yeah. And my view is you can't carry economic integration beyond the point at which you have a political system to support it. Because within a state, it's the government that manages the market in the end. People elect a government, and the government is responsible for the economic results. But in a global market, who's responsible? The market. And then the neoclassical economist says, but the market always optimizes everyone's choice. If you have fully competitive markets, everyone gains. Everyone gets what they want. So in that sort of worldview, there are no losers. There are only winners, because it's all voluntary, and you only make voluntary bargains if you think you're going to get better, get good results from them. So the whole system, the whole way of thinking is distorted. And in my view, the Eurozone was set up without a state or without political superintendence, deliberately, in order to free capital from national control.
Yeah, during your panel discussion, I liked your comment to Mr. Constantia, when he was talking about expanding the power beyond the state, and you commented that show me this process, because the state is the only space where this legitimacy can be made because of the democracy process. Yeah. So, well, when I was listening to the panel discussion yesterday, I was remembering the same kind of discussion and arguments and clashes of ideas from 19th century. For instance, I remember the Friedrich List, German economist, who was opposing the idea of this international trade, and he was like talking about the national economy of the national system of the political economy. So my question is, are we today in the same situation when we have the crisis of the international trade, we have the international trade wars, and also we have the process which says that nation still matters. Yeah. So are we the same position like the world was in 19th century?
Well, we're in a better position in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, we're in a better position because we have learned a bit, and we've learned how if these tensions are allowed to fester and grow stronger, you might have a catastrophe at the end of the road. But the dynamics are the same. The dynamic processes haven't altered. Friedrich List, yes, rightly said, free trade is the doctrine of the strong. It's ideal for strong, but weaker and smaller countries need to protect themselves, because if they integrate too early, they lose the chance of developing their own industries because their costs are too high. So they have to have some protection, and I think that insight is valid. Mm-hmm. And so free trade is not good for everyone. And in practice, the successful countries have rarely been free traders while they were becoming successful. Yeah. I mean, even England in the 18th century, it subsidized its exports, it stopped its imports. China, they say China is free trade. Of course China isn't free trade, nor was Japan free trade. They're all in favor of freedom of their exports to go wherever they want, but not in favor of freedom of everyone to sell goods to China. They run, in other words, current account surpluses, and so that's always been that's the world. The academics have been free trade, and all said free trade is good, but the politicians and the voters have not been free trade. You get the same issue now with free movement of labor. Mm-hmm. It's one of the freedoms of the single market, but there's no government to manage the labor flows. It's as though the market. Yeah. Why should labor flows be completely free of governmental supervision and reacting, of course, democratically to people's sentiments? Why should labor be more free than goods or capital? I mean, all these things, we elect governments to give us results. And these governments are elected by national electorates. They're national governments. We don't have really a European government popularly elected. We have a European Parliament, and which has very low level of voter interest, and we don't have any political top. And then we have a civil service, and then so-called council of ministers of all the nations decide things. But there's no legitimacy in these economic projects.
This is kind of power crisis as well, right? So the dilemma, who is going to make the transformation, because the supranational institutions do not have this power because they do not have the legitimacy from the side.
I mean, when I said we were in a better position in the 19th century, what I meant was that there are some international, transnational institutions now which the 19th century lacked. I mean, for example, there's the United Nations, and then there's the IMF and.
Despite their wrong.
There are international institutions which can soften the struggle. The WTO, they're negotiating forums. They're forums in which nations can resolve their differences without taking warlike steps.
Yeah.
So we're better off in that way. But we haven't really found a sure, foolproof way of avoiding wars. And it was very interesting, I thought, that Mr. Constancio, who was on the panel with me, said that Europe only moves forward through crisis. And the immediate question that occurred to me was, of course, the post-war system was established through crisis. That is the crisis of the Second World War. How deep does the crisis have to be in order to get movement?
Yeah, he called it Jean Monnet.
I know. I mean, maybe little crises may be all right, but you can't control the size of the crisis if you decide that's your way forward. What you want to do is to prevent crisis, but by preventing crisis, you also prevent progress.
Right. Yeah.
So you're in a paradox there.
Yeah. And as for the crisis, like in 2009, when the Western world, especially Europe and US, was in the heart of the crisis, like in the global financial recession and then economic crisis, you published a book which influenced me very much, and also the academic sphere very much. And the title of the book is The Keynes, The Return of the Master.
Yeah.
So more than 12 years have passed since then, since the crisis. So what do you think, why the Keynes is important to explain what to do in the century of the international globalization and liberal globalization? What Keynes has to teach us,
Well,
I'm asking because yesterday Anne Potiphar explained us how wrongly understood Keynes is today, because some neoclassicals thinking that the Keynes is the author of the closed economy of the state, and Potiphar explained us that Keynes understood the internalization of the finance capital, so that's why he's important.
Well, she's quite right. I mean, Keynes, for some model purposes, he assumed a closed economy, but of course he was very aware of that the actual economy was an open economy, and that's why he was one of the architects of the Bretton Woods system, which I think when I said Keynes, the return of the master, as some critic unkindly pointed out, the master returned for 6 months and then was locked up in the cupboard again. That's true. Yeah. When they were really in the depth, they all flung their ammunition.
And you talked about that yesterday, like fiscal policy, like for 2 months.
And then the orthodox austerity policy kicked in, and I think that was a disaster for Europe, actually, because it meant that, and for Britain it was a disaster, but it meant that the economic crisis was prolonged by 2 or 3 years, and that's a lot of loss of output and a lot of loss of jobs in the interim, and it affected quite a lot of people. It was completely unnecessary, because the orthodox view was, and still is in a way, that you don't use fiscal policy in any way to manage the economy. And the ideal stance of fiscal policy is a budget balance. And if you're out of balance too much, you have to get back into balance as soon as possible. Whereas that's the wrong doctrine. I mean, a balance is an achievement of a balanced economy. It's not the way to get back into balance by cutting government spending. That's not the way to get back into balance if you're in a slum. And that was one of the lessons Keynes taught.
Yeah, and yesterday in your speech, I think you made a very central and very inspiring question on which your whole speech was based on. And you questioned if Keynes would vote against or pro-Brexit. So what do you think, like what Keynes would do today with regard to the Brexit process?
Well, you know, I think he was very skeptical about the economic principles on which there are two things, I think. There's the European Union. I think people don't really properly distinguish between the European Union and the European single currency or monetary union. I think Keynes would probably have wanted to remain in the European Union, although a lot of Keynesians after him were very much against Britain joining the European Union. And I think the reason they were against it was because they thought the nation state would lose certain tools of economic management.
The Labour Party was against it at that time.
Yeah, the Labour Party was against it. Yeah, I was at that conference in which I've lived a long time. Hugh Gates School. We must not join the European Union.
Mike Foote was against it.
Yeah, but of course at that time they were still a bit nostalgic for the empire. And they thought that was an alternative. But so a lot of the left were against joining the European Union. They thought it was a rich man's club. And it would work in the interests of not in the interests of the workers. I think Keynes would have seen some possibilities in working in the European Union. He would have been passionately against the Eurozone.
Because it's kind of gold standard.
Yeah, it's a gold standard. He would have seen it a gold standard. And you know, I think it's a great mistake that the Eurozone has become the flagship of the European Union, because there are a lot of people who feel very strongly pro-Europe, and they want Europe to succeed, but are against the Eurozone. So, in a way, the Eurozone doesn't help the cause of European Union, as I think Mr. Constancio said. It hinders, it obstructs the cause of European Union, because there are such strong economic criticisms you can make of the Eurozone, and its asymmetric effects. It's, as someone said, it's a rich man's club plus Germany.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and you shouldn't try to float the ship, the European ship, on this leaky vessel, the Eurozone. So Keynes would have said, I think he would have said most of this. At least, you know, you write about someone and then people say, well, what would Keynes have said? Because you're meant to know the mind of the person. But of course, you don't fully know the mind of anyone else. And then he was living, he died 80 years ago. So things have changed.
Robert, what I want to ask you is that, like you just mentioned very brilliant praise, the European Union countries and the Germany. If we see the history, we get back to the 1990s or the end of the 1980s, the system of the monetary structure of the European Union was Eurozone, was made by France. Actually, France was leading, Mitterrand was leading this process, kind of against Germany, because they were afraid of reunification, they were afraid of expanded industrial power of Germany. So they created the system like to govern Germany, actually, to make the Germany follow their rules. But things changed, actually. Everything happened vice versa. Now the Germany became the most powerful Eurozone countries. So how Germany did that, you know?
Well, I mean, France advocated it in order to tie down Germany, and Germany accepted it in order to block France. I mean, you know, of course. I mean, in other words, France wanted a stronger state-based system, whereas Germany didn't. And Germany was very it wasn't completely happy, but the Germans saw some advantages in the Eurozone, which they benefited from, and one of them, of course, is an undervalued exchange rate, because Germany on its own would the value of the Deutschmark would be greater than the value of the euro. And so that was an advantage for Germany. There were no institutions that were at all strong, except the Bundesbank, made into the European Central Bank. And so, in a way, the Germans said, yes, we'll agree to all this, but let's set it up on German terms. And the French wanted it anyway, to tie down Germany, but Germany escaped from the fetters, chains of a super state. I mean, the only super institution in the Eurozone is the ECB.
Yeah, and I have two questions like that. The first one is, yesterday or the day before yesterday, I asked Empathy4 and Mike Hudson why we should trust economists, because they failed us actually in 2008. So as a great economic historian, I'm asking the same question to you. Should we trust the economists which led the world kind of wrong direction before 2008?
Well, I don't think we should.
Empathy4 said no. You definitely should not trust.
I mean, I don't think we should trust them more than they deserve to be trusted. I mean, on some things, economists can clear up muddled thinking. Of course they can, because they think clearly about certain problems and accurately and efficiently. So in many respects, I mean, the world is better if economists have a big amount of power than if we were governed by generals. And their military logic. I mean, military logic, better, right? You can have military logic, it's time to make the war here. But economic logic, I mean, all these governing systems have logics. And then you have to compare which logic on the whole does more good than the other. And I think on the whole, economic logic makes for a more peaceful world than military logic. But on the other hand, efficiency, which is the goal of economics, isn't actually the highest goal. I mean, societies can only stand a certain amount of efficiency. They're happier with less efficiency on the whole, and so am I, and so are you. I mean, the person who's always efficient, who always optimizes their time, who's always calculating on an advantage or a disadvantage, who's always thinking about what is my opportunity cost in spending half an hour doing this program with you. That's not the way we like to think of ourselves, and it's in fact not the way people think of
We cannot rationalize everything.
We do things because we like it. We're with people because we like them or love them. I mean, and we form groups because we're part of the same family. I mean, all that sort of thing is sort of really left out of the economist's calculation. But then precisely those feelings which join us to other people can be exploited by politicians to foster hatred against other people. So it's very, very easy for politics to fall back into tribalism. And economics is a safeguard against that. That's the great value of it.
And Robert, my last question. During our interview, you mentioned that the developed countries did not follow the international trade to develop, right? So I remembered the most famous phrase from 19th century in US, don't do as Britons say to you, but do as they did. The same kind of logic comes from the international institutions we mentioned, IMF, World Bank. Do as we say. Joseph Stiglitz always likes to say like this, that do as we say, don't do as we did. It's kind of logic which comes from through their recommendations. So sometimes it means that like developing states prefer not to follow what they did, like industrial policy, industrialization of the economy, where the heart of the development process was the production. Yeah. So, what do you think? Like, what is the correct way of modern, like Georgia, for instance, as a post-Soviet country who is in a transition process? What the policy we should recommend and follow for the development of the country?
Yeah, well, an economist would say very plainly, Georgia should follow its comparative advantage. Where is the comparative advantage? And it should exploit its comparative advantages. And others would say...
Ricardian trap, as such.
Yeah, that's a Ricardian idea. Others would say, well, what might its future comparative advantages be? And try and protect those. This is the Friedrich List argument. What are its infant industries, which could become giants and grown up if they weren't being destroyed meanwhile by competition from more efficient producers of those things? So those are two broad models. And yet, I mean, really, they're not the fundamental questions. They're important economic questions, but the fundamental question is, how much material prosperity do you need for a people to feel at home in the world? And economic policy should always be subordinate to ethical and philosophical ideas. What kind of state would make most Georgians feel happiest or most contented in? You have to have a certain amount of material prosperity. You have to have a certain degree of equality. Yeah. Not complete, but a certain amount. And then you can start enjoying life for what it is. If you're always under economic hardship or very poor, it's more difficult. But you don't have to just grow and grow and grow and grow forever and ever and ever and ever. And anyway, we can't, because the planet will be extinguished if that's the goal we set ourselves. Yeah. So I think one's got to always think of economic development in an ethical, a moral, a social context. And then economics falls into place. We want to do this, yeah, economics can tell us how to do it efficiently, but it can't tell us what the ends of life, purposes of life are. Economics can't say a word about that.
Yeah, Lord Skidelsky, thank you for being with us.